Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 7th annual Aquinas Day Lecture. We are delighted that you have joined us this afternoon as we gather to celebrate the feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas. My name is Alice Cameron, and I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Aquinas Center. For our students and community members here on today's webinar, I'd like to share a little bit about our organization. The Aquinas Center has provided Catholic community programming for the past 34 years. Our mission serves the Archdiocese of Atlanta, Emory University, and the greater Atlanta community by creating these opportunities for dialogue that foster our faith. Aquinas Day is brought to you in partnership with Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology. As we begin today's celebration, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Susan Reynolds, the Interim Director of Catholic Studies. Dr. Reynolds is also a contributing writer for Commonweal magazine and is a frequent contributor to national conversations on Catholicism in the media, including NPR, PBS NewsHour, NBC, and CNN. Please welcome Dr. Susan Reynolds.
Thanks, Alice. Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Reynolds, and I'm currently serving as Interim Director of Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology. It's my joy to welcome you to our annual celebration of Aquinas Day. I want to extend a special welcome to our friends throughout Candler School of Theology, Emory University, the Archdiocese of Atlanta, and beyond, who are essential partners in our shared work. On Aquinas Day, we celebrate the partnership between the Aquinas Center of Theology and Catholic Studies at Candler, and we especially celebrate our vibrant, diverse, and growing Catholic community here. Now in its 4th year, the Catholic Studies program at Candler has flourished thanks to the support of Dean Jan Love, academic Dean Jonathan Strom, and our many campus and community partners, and above all, our marvelous students. And through it all, the Aquinas Center has been and continues to be our most unflagging partner in this work. Because the Aquinas Center is an institution in the Dominican tradition and is named for the great Dominican saint and doctor of the Church, Thomas Aquinas, we celebrate the Catholic presence at Candler each year on or around his feast day, which happens to be tomorrow, January 28th. Had an in-person gathering been possible, our time today would have included not only worship in this lecture, but also a shared meal and ample time for fellowship. Nevertheless, we count ourselves fortunate that this virtual event means that we're currently joined by friends from across the country, perhaps even beyond. We welcome you to Candler. We're delighted that you're here to learn and celebrate with us. Now I'll turn things over to Callie Tabor of the Aquinas Center, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Susan. And good afternoon, everyone. As Susan said, my name is Callie Tabor, and I have the really great pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Jessica Copeland, and moderating the questions for today's events. But before I do so, I'd like to begin with just a couple of items to draw your attention to. The first is that Jessica's talk today draws from her recently published book, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression. And we're happy to say that her publisher, Liturgical Press, is very kindly offering 20% off of the book and free standard shipping to anyone who attends this lecture. So we'll put a link in the chat, which you can click on or use the promo code Dust in the Blood, or Dust22, I should say, which we'll also put in the chat. That discounted offer expires on February 15th, so get your copy right after the lecture today. Second, as you'll all be aware, Jessica's lecture will discuss depression and some sensitive mental health concerns. If you are an Emory student who is experiencing mental health concerns, large or small, we really encourage you to utilize the counseling and psychological services that are available to you freely through Emory. They have a number of hotlines and text lines available at any time of day or night, and you can always schedule an appointment with CAPS as well. So you can find more information about that in the link that we will also be posting in the chat. Throughout the lecture, if a question occurs to you, we encourage you to go ahead and put that in the Q&A box, use the Q&A function rather than the chat. We'll be taking some time at the end of the lecture for Jessica to answer your questions and talk a little bit more in detail about the subjects that she'll be discussing today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jessica Copeland, who is delivering the Aquinas Day lecture for today. As Susan mentioned, Aquinas Day serves two purposes, really. One is to celebrate the Catholic community here at Candler and Emory, and we certainly wish we could be gathered with you all today. But the second is to invite the Emory and larger community to hear from early career scholars who are helping to shape the direction of Catholic theology into the future and addressing some pressing concerns for our community today. And through her lecture and research on depression, Dr. Jessica Copeland is without a doubt doing just that. Dr. Coblentz received her MTS from Harvard Divinity School and her Ph.D. from Boston College. In addition to her research on mental health and theology, Jessica works in Catholic systematic theology, exploring feminist theologies, theological anthropology, and theologies of suffering. She is currently Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Indiana. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Aquinas Center and to Catholic Studies at Candler for the tremendous honor of serving as this year's Aquinas Day lecturer, and for the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you on this webinar. Today, I'll offer a glimpse of some of the ideas from my recently published book, which Callie just mentioned, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, with hopes that it will generate some discussion and ongoing reflection about what Christianity has to offer those who live with depression, which undoubtedly includes many of us on this webinar. I'll begin by sharing about why more Christian talk about depression is important, before turning to the notion of depression as a wilderness experience. I'll introduce both the experiential and theological foundations for conceiving of depression as a wilderness experience, and then conclude with an account of what this theological approach to depression could afford us. I probably don't need to convince this audience of the need for more conversation about depression at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to widespread mental health struggles and new media attention to the psychological distress that many of us are living with. Research on the current increase in mental health challenges is alarming in and of itself, but it is all the more so in view of the fact that before the pandemic, depression was already a serious and a relatively prevalent condition, with one measure estimating that 17.3 million Americans and a total of 264 million global citizens suffered from depression in 2017 alone. What's more, before the pandemic, this condition already disproportionately affected the poor and vulnerable, to whom God has bound God's self, the people to whom we, as God's people, ought to bind our lives as well. Before the pandemic, women already experienced higher rates of depression than men, something that tracks with pandemic research on mental health as well. Transgender youth were already nearly 4 times more likely to experience depression than their cisgender peers. Meanwhile, cis, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer teens experience significantly more depressive symptoms and higher rates of suicidality than their heterosexual peers. Before the pandemic, racial minorities with depression in the US were more likely to experience extended and severely debilitating symptoms than white Americans with the same condition. At this moment, when our societal and ecclesial spotlights are turned to mental health, perhaps as never before, it is important for us to have thoughtful and honest conversations about this suffering, and to recognize that depression is not merely a pandemic problem. It was already a significant human problem before the pandemic began. And unfortunately, we don't have reason to believe it will go away when the pandemic lifts. Yet even among those of us who agree that more conversation about depression is needed, some are probably a bit skeptical about the necessity of more Christian discourse about depression. I hear this skepticism from a lot of Christians who assert that because depression is a disease or illness, it should be a matter of medicine and not religion. As such, questions of depression ought to be dealt with in the therapist's office or the hospital, not the sanctuary or the seminary. This compartmentalization of mental health on the one hand and faith on the other is not simply the result of a desire to keep the realms of science and religion separate, though that may be part of it. Very often, Christians seem compelled to cordon off mental health struggles from their own faith tradition because they have come to mistrust the church on these matters. Today, many in evangelical and Pentecostal communities hear that depression is a sin or the result of a sufferer's sinfulness. This moral diagnosis appeals to some Christians because it promises that repentance from sin can heal and stave off depression. But others are put off by this explanation, which can seem to shame and stigmatize depression sufferers. Meanwhile, other Christians, especially those in Catholic and other Protestant traditions, are more likely to hear that depression is a sacred opportunity, a special cross to bear, or a dark night of the soul that God bestows upon people to help them grow in faith. Some Christians find this to be a hopeful message that inspires them to persevere and search for meaning amid their mental pain. Yet to others, this sounds like a message of toxic positivity, one that dismisses the horrors and meaninglessness that constitute many experiences of depression. Discontent with these prevailing Christian messages about depression, some Christians determine that it is best to just separate mental illness from the realm of faith altogether. Leave depression to the psychologists and the social workers, they say, far away from the pastors and the theologians. I'm sympathetic to this sort of preemptive retreat from the church, insofar as it reflects a desire to protect depression sufferers from the harm that theology can inflict on the vulnerable. But I also have some concerns about taking up this position as the only alternative to insufficient Christian ideas about depression. For one, telling those who live with depression that mental health struggles are irrelevant to their faith lives and communities sets up sufferers for religious abandonment, what I call in the context of depression a double displacement. Already, many depression sufferers describe their depression as a kind of dislocation into another world. It is an encompassing, harsh reality where their otherwise typical experiences of connection, meaning-making, and agency often diminish or dissipate altogether. When Christians find themselves displaced to this inhospitable world, many turn to their faith communities in search of some familiar experience of belonging and purpose and hope. When these depression sufferers are met with insufficient messages about depression, or when they are told that their depression has nothing to do with the realm of faith, what can result is another second form of displacement. By distancing depression sufferers from the Christian community and its resources, the church imposes another form of exile. At present, we cannot wholly prevent or eradicate depression, but Christians can do a great deal more to curtail this second displacement. The church can determine not to abandon sufferers as they endure this difficult condition. Even when one sees depression as a disease or illness that should be treated with the very best of medicine and the psychological sciences, it need not follow that Christianity has nothing to do with this condition. Insofar as many depression sufferers are turning to their Christian communities for belonging and purpose and hope, we ought to consider whether Christianity has resources to meet these needs. And as a theologian, I'm especially interested in Christianity's theological resources. To those for whom existing Christian messages about depression are insufficient, what else does Christian theology have to offer? When I began to investigate this question, I found that we need only listen to the stories of depression sufferers to find some really rich theological possibilities. As I just mentioned, sufferers regularly characterize their depression as an experience of dislocation into a strange and inhospitable world. It is an engrossing, harsh landscape, a wilderness even. And that's something about which Christian theologians have a great deal to say. In Jeffrey Smith's memoir of depression, for example, he attests to how depression remakes the world, transporting its sufferers from their native land to another chambered and unearthly landscape, its origins obscure, its meridians unmapped. Several draw on Dante to represent depression with this geographical imagery as well. At the conclusion of William Styron's memoir, he quotes these famous lines from the Inferno. "In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the right path." While the Italian poet used this image of the dark wood to represent his journey through purgatory and hell, Styron recalls that the return from the abyss of depression is not unlike the ascent of the poet, trudging upward and upward out of hell's black depths. Therese Burchard similarly alludes to Dante in her memoir, writing that she felt her way blindfolded through the woods of depression and anxiety. Why is it that when many sufferers struggle for the right words to convey this condition, they turn to this particular figurative speech? Well, first, this wilderness imagery communicates that the experience of depression is not as relatable as many presume it to be. In contrast to popular characterizations of depression as a form of long and severe sadness, these geographical descriptors push us to recognize depression as something far stranger than this ordinary emotion. Living with depression is not just a series of bad days, which is an unfortunate but rather customary part of how everyone experiences the world from time to time. No, depression is like living in another world altogether. This imagery conveys that depression is far more encompassing than ordinary emotion. It is an alien and unearthly landscape, a radical shift in one's experience of life. That sufferers characterize this other world as inhospitable suggests how it differs from one's typical experience of living. Whereas most of us move throughout our lives, taking for granted possibilities of connection, purpose, agency, futurity, even on bad days, many depression sufferers describe life in the world of depression quite differently. This contrast came into focus for Jeffrey Smith during a visit he took to see family in the Allegheny foothills after years away. There, he was suddenly taken by a feeling of at-homeness that had been absent from his life in recent months as he struggled with depression. The feeling of familiarity with his surroundings, of feeling restored and connected to others, of reveling vibrant for the first time in many, many months, put into focus for Smith the contrasting qualities of the depressive state he had been living in. Depression is a land deficient of many taken for granted features of life that make most living easy and often good: possibility, meaning, hope, interconnection. Depression is another landscape, concludes Smith, one as remote as the Yukon from the quotidian world. It is, to use the apt language of phenomenology, a decidedly unhomelike place. What does Christian theology have to offer depression sufferers who find themselves dwelling unwillfully in an unhomelike world such as this? Well, Christianity's sacred scriptures abound with stories of dislocation into unhomelike places. Indeed, so plentiful is this imagery in the scriptural canon that Walter Brueggemann characterizes the Bible as primarily concerned with the issue of being displaced and yearning for a place. He labels the Israelites a landless folk and God's homeless people because of the frequency with which they are unmoored from home and immersed in a harsh and unfamiliar landscape. Frequently, these unfamiliar places are called wildernesses, a term that has both literal and figurative uses in the scriptures. Literally, they were specific terrains in the ancient world compared to, say, valleys or gardens. These wilderness terrains were known to be difficult to domesticate in service of human nourishment and flourishing. Because the literal wildernesses were known for their inhospitality to human life, biblical authors frequently employed the wilderness as a symbolic image for human experiences of precarity, struggle, and even fatality. Thus, even when the Bible depicts actual earthly turf, these places often simultaneously function as symbols of something else as well. It is no surprise then that over the course of Christian history, religious teachers and writers read biblical stories of literal untamed land as meaningful analogs for the human struggles of the present day. The writings of the medieval mystics contain correlations between the deserts of the scriptures and the figurative wildernesses that they experienced in relation to God. Symbolic interpretations of geographical displacement continued through the Protestant Reformation and the rest of the modern era, from Luther's use of the Babylonian exile as an extended metaphor for the captivity of the laity, to John Bunyan's classic, The Pilgrims Progress, which combines scriptural allusions to present a journey through what one scholar called the wilderness of the religious and political turmoil of the English 17th century. In more recent theological discourse, we find additional examples, such as Dolores Williams' classic, Sisters in the Wilderness, which identifies the suffering of African-American women with the wilderness experiences of Hagar. This tradition of correlating biblical wildernesses to contemporary experience has not only helped Christians see the realities of their lives in the scriptures, it has also afforded them insights about how God relates to the circumstances of life like their own. Approaching depression as a wilderness experience in view of these biblical narratives could likewise offer Christian sufferers more ways of interpreting their condition in relation to God and the truths of the Christian faith, something that could curtail that second religious displacement that often accompanies the primary dislocation of depression. Indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, variations in why the Israelites find themselves in difficult territory, how they experience these places, and how God responds to them provide an array of theological implications for interpreting depressive experience. Consider, for example, the story of Abraham, who is commissioned by God to leave his native land to establish a new life in Canaan. Taking up the patriarch's sojourn through unfamiliar and inhospitable lands as an analog for depression One might identify depression as a journey toward a better place that God intends. This view aligns with existing messages about depression as a sort of cross to bear, as a condition that should be embraced for some higher divine purpose. The Babylonian exile, in which the Jewish people were removed from Canaan following the destruction of the temple, can serve as the basis for yet another Christian interpretation of depression. Prophetic calls to repentance echo across the writings of the exilic era, and their messages are clear. The people of Israel strayed from right relationship with God, sinning against God and betraying their fellow creatures, which makes them complicit in their displacement. Reading the experience of this exile as an analogy for depression would suggest that depression sufferers are morally culpable for their suffering and should in turn repent if they are ever to escape this harrowing condition. This, of course, aligns with another common message that depression is a sin or the result of some other sinful aspect of a sufferer's life. Already, just these two examples show that some wilderness correlations lend themselves to views of depression that are already prevalent in many US Christian communities. As such, these may not be the wilderness correlations that Christians around us are most in need of. Other tales of the biblical wilderness can expand the Christian messages about depression that are on offer, however. One that I've become particularly captivated by is the wilderness experience of Hagar from Genesis 21. As many of you know, Hagar was an enslaved woman in the house of Abraham and his wife, Sarah. After Hagar becomes pregnant with Ishmael's child, she flees into the wilderness where she encounters God, who instructs her to return to the clan with her newborn son, Ishmael. When we meet Hagar again, she has returned to life with Abraham and Sarah, who now also has a son of her own, Isaac. When the sight of young Ishmael and Isaac together provokes Sarah to demand Hagar's expulsion, Abraham consults God and eventually complies with Sarah's wish. Hagar is displaced into the wilderness with her infant son, and having been given very little water, they soon find themselves in death-bound circumstances. From this wilderness, Hagar cries out to God, "Do not let me look upon the death of the child." God then calls to Hagar and opens her eyes to a well of water. Hagar's story ends there in the wilderness as the text gives way to Ishmael's story. It reads, "God was with the boy and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him in the land of Egypt." Absent from Hagar's story of forced displacement into the wilderness are justifications of a higher purpose or some other theological reason that accounts for the onset of her lifetime of struggle in this difficult terrain. Though on a human level, there are several bad actors involved in her expulsion. The malice and neglect of Abraham and Sarah do not explain why, on a theological level, God permits such treacherous behavior among humans. Based on the text itself, Hagar's subsequent lifetime in the wilderness cannot be justified as an inherent good, something worthwhile for the spiritual edification it promises, nor can it be explained as a punishment for sin when there is no mention of anything about her sin. Furthermore, recognizing that her suffering results from the sinfulness of others does not explain why God relates to Hagar's suffering as God does, permitting it and withholding rescue from life in this harsh landscape. As far as we can tell, this suffering is in itself nonsensical, meaningless. We are left with a theological mystery. This makes Hagar's wilderness experience different from Abraham's or the Babylonian exile, and it suggests a very different theology of God and suffering than many prevailing Christian messages about depression. At the same time, Hagar's suffering clearly matters to God. In a previous wilderness experience, Hagar had named this God, the God who sees, and then named her son Ishmael, meaning God hears. Although God does not reveal to Hagar a justification or purpose for her suffering, God does see and hear her in her suffering. God is present to Hagar's pain in ways that Christian depression sufferers often identify as really significant. What's more, by opening up Hagar's eyes to this vital well of water, God reveals new possibilities for survival and even improved quality of life that Hagar herself could not perceive. Observing this, Dolores Williams cites the womanist adage that God makes a way out of no way. By revealing new possibilities for living in this death-bound place, God does indeed help Hagar chart an otherwise unforeseen path for her life. In view of this, we can see how bringing Hagar's story to bear on contemporary depressive suffering could affirm the reality of those whose depression resists our standard messages of justification and purpose, while at the same time inviting sufferers to consider whether their suffering might nevertheless matter to the benevolent God of the Christian faith, the God who is profoundly concerned and attentive to the suffering and the distraught. Hagar's story also invites fellow sufferers to hold out for the emergence of yet unforeseen possibilities of community and agency and meaning and hope, possibilities that depression sufferers often long for. With this very brief look at the theological implications of these wilderness correlations, I hope you have an idea of what this particular approach to depression might look like. I want to conclude by naming some of the unique affordances of this theological approach for your consideration as well. First, approaching depression as a wilderness experience immediately expands our scriptural resources for reflection on this condition. The prospect of correlating the harsh landscapes of scripture to depression, though not unprecedented in the Christian tradition, is quite different from how contemporary Christians tend to engage scripture in their interpretations of depression. Most often, Christians read depression into the scriptures in a rather literal fashion. They identify the lamentations of Jeremiah as depression, for example, suggesting that the prophet experienced the same condition that many people do today. In addition to presenting some historiographical problems, this literal approach narrows the relevance of the biblical text to scenes of sadness and misery alone. While such scenes are not uncommon throughout the scriptures, as you may know, they constitute but one rather limited option for bringing depression into correlation with the scriptures. Additionally, this literal approach reinforces the common reduction of depression to sadness, which many depression sufferers dismiss as inaccurate, as I noted earlier. Thus, correlating depression to wilderness imagery has the potential to both expand possibilities for interpreting depression within the biblical narrative and to extend more resources to sufferers who don't identify their depression with sadness alone. Sometimes equating depression with sadness is a means of actually diminishing the extraordinary difficulty of this condition. In view of that, a second affordance of approaching depression as a wilderness experience is that I think it can better honor the difficulty of depression, something sufferers attest to, but which is often denied and downplayed by others. For all the variance in the Bible's theological associations with the wilderness is clearly and consistently depicted as a difficult place for people to inhabit. Though the wilderness is also a place where people often encounter God in transformative ways, that does not negate the constitutive inhospitality of this landscape. Thus, to correlate depression with the biblical image of the wilderness is to affirm from a Christian perspective that depression is a tremendously difficult condition for living, though one not necessarily absent from the presence of God. The third affordance of approaching depression as a wilderness experience concerns the multiple and divergent theological implications of this biblical imagery. Some might see the theological diversity of this biblical imagery as a shortcoming of this paradigm for depression. After all, suggesting that depression is a wilderness experience will not settle all of the pressing theological questions that sufferers bring to the Christian tradition, such as why me and what should I do and what will come of this? Biblical wilderness imagery resists any simple or simplistic response to these inquiries, for the Bible's wilderness tales offer multiple responses to these questions. Though some may find this confusing or unhelpful, there is also reason to see this multivalence as precisely what makes this imagery such a fecund resource for depression sufferers seeking to interpret their conditions. Indeed, the theological plurality of wilderness imagery is an alternative, even a corrective, to the exclusionary messages that Christians often impose onto suffering. The message that your depression is because of your sin, or that your depression is a gift from God that you must submit to. These prescriptive messages delimit how sufferers should view and relate to their suffering and their God. They preemptively constrain possibilities for meaning making and belie the mystery of suffering. If this sliver of a theological interpretation does not work for a depression sufferer, then she may be left to believe that Christianity has little else to offer her. What's more, the exclusivity of prevailing messages about depression reflects a degree of theological certainty that is simply dishonest. We don't know for certain how God relates to the suffering of others. So why are we imposing these interpretations of depression onto others as if we did? Alternatively, for the sufferer who is invited to explore how her suffering is and is not akin to the wilderness experiences of the scriptures, she will find not one set of theological claims to accept or reject, but rather a panoply of theological possibilities to consider. Some depression sufferers may engage wilderness narratives and interpretations of them that reinscribe prevailing Christian messages about depression. Others may not. Whatever the case, opening up multiple theological possibilities could be a valuable offering to depression sufferers and those who accompany them in the process of theologizing this condition. Likewise, for Christian communities that strive to address mental health conditions, likening depression to a wilderness experience may serve to represent the condition without imposing meaning on it, something we Christians so frequently do from the perch of our pulpits and in the pages of our self-help books. To invite Christians to reflect on depression as a wilderness experience does not necessarily imply that it is sinful or the result of sin, or not, that it is a blessing from God for one's own good, or not, or that it necessarily holds some other alternative theological status, or not. What this invitation to theological reflection entails at the most basic level is an affirmation of the difficulty and precarity of depressive experience, as well as God's general relation to it. Another fourth affordance to this approach concerns the experiential and interpretive shifts that frequently occur across the course of living with this chronic and recurring condition. Sociologist David Karp's work shows that the meanings a sufferer assigns to her depression may resonate and serve her for a time, but a need for alternative interpretations sometimes emerge as her condition and context shift. Just like the Israelites, who as one community had multiple wilderness experiences and various interpretations of them, so too the wildernesses that a depression sufferer initially identifies with may not be the ones that she always associates with, as her experiences or interpretations of depression shift. It is conceivable that an image as theologically multivalent as the wilderness may be able to accommodate some of these fluctuations, remaining relevant to a sufferer, even as she weighs different interpretations of her condition. This flexibility may help to stave off that double displacement that can magnify the suffering of depression among many Christians. Fifth and finally, just as the plurality of wilderness imagery can be a refreshing alternative to a religious context where Christians tend to impose judgment, telling one another what their suffering must mean, this multiplicity may also be an appealing resource in a broader social context where mental health conditions such as depression are often maligned and stigmatized. For this point, I'm indebted to theologian Richard Arundel, who, building on the work of Susan Sontag, notes how talk about depression in church and society tends to characterize it antagonistically as an enemy that is hostile towards us and that needs to be overcome and destroyed. Though some depression sufferers certainly characterize their own depression this way, sometimes quite literally, identifying their depression as the work of the devil, Arundel cautions that the prevalence of this perspective in society limits sufferers' perceived possibilities for interpreting and responding to their conditions. Arundel is naming how narrative and metaphorical language can shape and limit one's perception of mental illness. And in the case of society's antagonistic metaphors for mental health conditions, he argues that they have the power to perpetuate harmful ideas about conditions like depression. He writes, if we dwell in the language of the negative and the military, think enemy, there is a serious danger that this will set the agenda for the people this language is used for and against. Arundel points to the biblical image of the wilderness as an alternative to this. And it is precisely its theological plurality and ambiguity that makes it ideal. Unlike the enemy language that perpetuates the negative judgments against mental health conditions that prevail in our society, speaking of depression as a wilderness need not bring with it these inherently pejorative associations. In fact, the Bible is full of wilderness experiences wherein a person blossoms, where one meets God in a new way. The multivalence of wilderness imagery with its range of moral associations is therefore a potential corrective to an almost singular negativity that we find in society's views of depression and other mental health conditions. To wrap up my prepared remarks, I want to emphasize that while I focus today on viewing depression as a wilderness experience, I do not believe this is the only way to effectively understand and respond to depression from a Christian perspective. As I've shown, the multiple and varied theological implications of the wilderness are an asset of this approach. And that is because depression sufferers need and deserve a much wider array of theological possibilities as they navigate this harrowing condition. The long Christian tradition of theologizing wilderness experience can provide some, but surely not all of the resources that are needed among those who suffer. So I hope that all of you, all members of the church, all people of faith, will join in continuing to develop additional theological resources. We cannot resign to leave depression sufferers displaced and alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for taking us into the wilderness and helping us to see the meanings in the wilderness that could be fruitful, I think, especially for those of us who are in theological education, to kind of relinquish the necessity for a sort of security and a sort of power that comes with having an explanation, and instead to sort of embrace accompaniment, right, in many ways. We have a number of questions and a number of just thanks that are coming in. So many people appreciate what you've shared with us today. So I want to go ahead and start getting into the questions. If you have a question and you haven't yet put it into the chat or the Q&A, I'd encourage you to put in the Q&A. We can find it more easily there. So first of all, we have someone who says, thank you very much for taking on this project. Can you speak to the affective aspect of hope, or name any theological resources that you found that address that affective aspect adequately in relationship to depression?
That's a great question. It's a question that I suspect will leave me searching once we end this webinar, because I'm not sure if the resources that are coming to mind are precisely what the questioner has in mind when they ask about affective dimensions of hope. I will mention a fantastic book on hope that has really influenced my thinking throughout this project, and that is William Lynch's sort of classic book on hope called Images of Hope. And a significant part of Lynch's project on hope depends upon his own sort of phenomenology of mental illness and other sort of situations of despair that either he's experienced personally or has been present to throughout his life. And he talks very powerfully about the sort of impossibility of hope that many people experience. And it's one of those books where, you know, every once in a while he just has a line or two that will linger with you. One of them for me is that he says hope is a communal word, or hope is a communal project, something like that. I'm butchering it now. But to me, it suggested just the importance of hoping with other people. And for folks who are dealing with many forms of depression that diminish possibilities of hope for them, he argues that it's really important to have other people who can imagine possibilities beyond what the sufferer herself can perceive in the midst of her struggle. And so he talks a lot about imagination, hence the kind of images of hope, and talks about the importance of imagining together and accompanying each other in imagination in these times where we often experience a very real inability to imagine beyond a certain point. So that's one that comes to mind that I recommend.
And as you were speaking, the question asker replied in the chat that she was also thinking of Lynch, actually, and said thank you, and that hope without serotonin is a topic that needs attention. So
yes,
very, very thankful for that. The next question, there are a few questions where folks are engaging with other scriptural images and kind of asking for reflection on how they might engage with this topic as well. So this asks, have you ever considered or looked at any accounts of wilderness experiences in the New Testament, specifically Jesus's time in the wilderness or John the Baptist's emergence from the wilderness? What might be helpful or problematic about these accounts? And could we view sufferers as prophetic witnesses, like John the Baptist, who are calling the church to account for their complacency?
I love this idea. You know, in my look at how wilderness imagery has been used throughout theology, I certainly noticed the continued prevalence of wilderness imagery in and through the New Testament, and the ways in which it is used both figuratively and literally there too. The questioner is giving a great example of this. I hadn't myself thought about whether John the Baptist's emergence from the wilderness might be or might have implications for how we think about depression, but I love what this questioner just kind of off the cuff has suggested. So I would like to think more about that, and would certainly welcome further conversation with the questioner about that, because just my immediate impression is that there's something there. So thank you.
Yeah, and we have another question in a similar vein, also wondering about Jesus's wilderness experience and how that could that be connected to an account of sort of depression, or perhaps even this questioner is asking even suicidal ideation. Could that be connected in some way as we look to the New Testament examples?
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea that I have not myself thought about, and I suspect that the questioner is thinking about the sort of temptation to throw himself off the cliff as something that might suggest this sort of suicidal ideation. I haven't thought about that in particular, but would love to continue thinking about that. The New Testament scene, the gospel scene that I've kind of thought most extendedly about in relation to depression is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Dorte Zola's reading of the Garden of Gethsemane. She does that in conversation with her concept of mute suffering. Which I find to have a lot of resonances with how many depression sufferers describe their experience. I've thought about that. The thing about that is that it's a garden, which is not a wilderness. So it doesn't quite get at what these really generative questions are suggesting. But I would love to think more about that with them.
Yeah. Now, another question relating not to scripture, but actually to another resource from the tradition, theological resource, which is Mechtilde of Magdeburg's Flowing Light of the Godhead, which this questioner says has some really fascinating wilderness moments. And there's a quote: "You should drink the water of suffering and ignite the fire of love with the kindling of virtue. Then you are living in the true desert." As you know, this could be read as a prescriptive gift of God view of depression. So to what extent can sufferers value the insight gained from their wilderness experiences without glorifying them in that kind of toxic or unhealthy way?
It's a great question, and I'm grateful for another great resource recommendation. I have found it really important to distinguish the imperative that suffering inherently means something and is inherently a good thing, and that will necessarily engender spiritual growth or a gift. There's a difference between that kind of prescription of meaning onto suffering and the affirmation that suffering, like any part of our lives, can be a source for potential meaning making or something like that. The difference between it must be and it can be, I think, is really, really important. And I think that difference is crucial for sidestepping these sort of potentially harmful impositions of meaning that come with, seeing depression necessarily as spiritually edifying, versus what I see to be like a hopeful but more open-handed suggestion that depression, like lots of part of our lives, can often be harnessed by people to gain insight, to grow closer to God. And certainly there are lots of depression sufferers who see their depression that way. Often it happens in retrospect and not necessarily in the moment. But many certainly do, and I would not want to I would not want to dismiss that possibility, but I think it's important to talk about it as a possibility and not something that one must inherently find if they are looking at their depression and their suffering in the right way.
Right. And I think, that question ties to something else that I'm seeing being asked, which is sort of, Mechthild is one example, but we might think of other kind of John of the Cross, or how much do we want to unlink, right, the kind of dark night of the soul spiritual idea in the Christian tradition from kind of contemporary experiences of depression is a question that's being asked.
Yeah. Well, scholars who are much more knowledgeable in Carmelite spirituality and the dark night of the soul have addressed this so that I don't have to do that myself. One is Kevin Culligan, I want to say is his name, who's a Carmelite psychologist who has written about the fact that he thinks that sometimes the dark night of the soul and depression can co-occur, but he says that it is actually really important to distinguish them. One, because there are some experiential differences to these that he thinks are important to honor as both a kind of spiritual director and a psychologist. These two conditions also warrant different types of accompaniment, depression is best served, he says, by treatment with psychologists and healthcare professionals, in addition to pastoral care and things like that. Whereas the dark night of the soul does not warrant that in the same way. And so he says it's really important actually for spiritual directors and other pastors to learn about these conditions so that they can be recognized as distinct things. What I would also say is that the theological associations that we have with the dark night of the soul shouldn't necessarily be projected onto depression, which is another reason to kind of think about these as distinct conditions. The dark night of the soul, extremely difficult based on what I have read, but it has a particular context in the spiritual life, and it bears a particular fruit in the spiritual life that depression does not always bear. And so we should try to think about these things differently, even as there's some experiential overlap that Culligan and several other theologians have talked about.
And I think that overlap, but also distinction is important for the kind of next question I'm seeing, which is more of a pastoral and practical question, which is for those who are in the clergy. This person is asking, how do we prepare ourselves to better understand depression and to minister to those who suffer with depression? Also then determining when it's best to kind of say, this is beyond my skill set, this person needs to seek, medical kind of advice.
Mm-hmm. A couple things come to mind. I think one kind of maybe a sort of obvious answer is that I think pastors can take the initiative to educate themselves, and there's now actually a lot of ways that can happen. There are programs like mental health first aid, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sort of mental health training so that people of all sorts, including pastors, will know how to recognize particularly severe and forms of mental health crises, and will have the basic skills they need not only to recognize it, but respond to it effectively and connect a person who's struggling with the resources that they need. There are, lots of mental health kind of basics that are accessible online through organizations like NAMI, N-A-M-I, which is a sort of national organization that advocates for folks with mental illness. There are also a lot of Christian books that you can find now written by psychologists who are aimed at giving people like pastors basic education on mental illness so that they can recognize it in their congregations. All that being said, I think sometimes it's easy to be really overwhelmed by all of this information about mental health, and overwhelmed by the real seriousness of these conditions in people's lives. And so I think sometimes people feel like they have to learn all this stuff before they can be competent ministers to people. Because of that, I also increasingly want to tell folks in the church, like, people with mental health struggles, as you know, are also just people who are suffering and who need love and accompaniment. They also can often tell you what they need. You know, I need help finding help. I need somebody to be with me right now because I'm not okay. And I actually think a lot of the basic gifts of ministers, a lot of the basic training of ministers prepares you all for that. And so I would trust that. And I would also trust your own instincts when someone is in front of you who has needs that you cannot handle yourself, right? That happens not only in situations of mental health crises, but, you know, in a host of situations that I'm sure pastors encounter. And so I would educate yourselves, and feel free to email me. I'm happy to send you some resources if that would be helpful. Educate yourselves, but also trust your instincts and your training and your ability to love your congregants. That goes a long, long way.
Yeah, I think that's the spirit of that goes to some of these other questions I'm seeing also about the kind of ecclesial context, but less about if you're the person who's the minister in the space, and more about what if I'm a community member? What if we think about how should our community be in order to try to avoid this double displacement, in order to feel like this person who is in the wilderness is still welcome in our church space? How should we be to kind of reach out in that way?
Mm-hmm. One resource that I want to recommend that comes to mind is, it's actually a resource that I learned about years ago from Candler's own Professor Helen Kim. There is a kind of newsletter, a website called Mental Health Ministries. I think it's quarterly, maybe monthly, but you can sign up. Anybody can sign up. And it regularly sends out educational materials, as well as like ideas for how congregations can actively support people who have mental health conditions. One thing I really like about this newsletter is that they're attentive to the kind of really broad and diverse needs of people with mental illness. So it's not only a kind of range of conditions that they address, but also, like, you know, different kind of age groups, or folks of different sexual orientations, or racial and ethnic groups. Like, they kind of have some resources that are specialized towards addressing and welcoming those needs within your communities. And that's for everybody. You know, we can't just leave this to pastors. We need everybody to kind of get involved and to become more welcoming. So Mental Health Ministries, that's one place where you can get some ongoing ideas about this. Another thing I would say is that I think congregations are uniquely positioned to address some of the big kind of social issues that make life with depression and other mental illnesses really, really difficult. In my book, I talk about mental health stigma, but I also talk about kind of access to healthcare. And these are things that are ongoing structural obstacles for people who are often just trying to survive and get basic treatment for mental health conditions. And it's going to take collective movements to improve these realities. These are social problems, healthcare inequity and mental health stigma. These are social problems that are going to require kind of social responses. And as collectives, as congregations, we can kind of mobilize in a unique way to address these and make a real material difference for the people in our midst who have these conditions and are facing these social obstacles. I think that kind of sustained activism also sends a message to the people in your community that you're not just, publicly saying we welcome people with mental illness, although I think that can make a difference, something as simple as that, or praying for folks who are suffering with depression publicly in a church, that can make a difference. But those are relatively easy things to do. And I think what could really make a difference is if we mobilize in our churches to actually address these realities that immediately affect people with mental illness. Not to mention the fact that, addressing homophobia, racism, sexism, these other social issues have repercussions for folks with mental illness, often compounding their suffering. We have to contend with that and mobilize in our congregations to address that if we actually want to make a substantial difference in the lives of those with these conditions.
Thanks for that really comprehensive answer. And I see that very kindly some of our community members have been putting a lot of these resources, links to them in the chat as you're speaking. So if any of those resources are things that you would like to utilize, be sure to find them in the chat. Many of them are there already, which is wonderful. And, naming is a very small thing. And also I can remember the first time I was in a church that prayed for those who are suffering from depression or other mental health concerns. That was noticeable. Mm-hmm. And so I think even beginning to make that, a conscious topic of our congregational life is important. Yeah. So
can I add one thing, Callie, that I just forgot to mention? What I also would encourage folks to do is just Google, if you're a member of a denomination, Google your denomination in mental health. There are an increasing number of denominations here in the United States who have mental health ministries of some sorts, and often their resources will be tailored to the realities of your congregation. If you have particular liturgical practices, they often have resources to interweave that into there, or connections to other aspects that might be specific to your denomination. So I recommend that as well.
That's great. Continuing this kind of line of thinking in our congregational spaces, there's another clergy member who writes, "Thank you for giving this excellent presentation and for opening up the wilderness to us. I'm thinking about the homiletical implications of your approach. The multivalence of the wilderness offers many possibilities for engagement and proclamation. Could you speak to a few possible interpretations that a preacher would want to avoid so as not to further wound the suffering?"
Sure. I mean, I suspect that those who are at the pulpit every weekend might have more ideas than I do, because I know you navigate these kinds of sensitivities around a lot of issues. The biggest thing for me is, trying to maintain some real humility around issues of suffering. I think this applies beyond the issue of depression, but certainly with more kind of stigmatized forms of suffering like depression. I would caution against, any kind of sermon that suggests a singular kind of meaning or approach to what the suffering is, a justification for why it's happening to somebody, a mandate about how somebody has to respond to it or ought to do that. And those things can be really, really subtle sometimes, even messages that I think sometimes people offer as words of encouragement, like, someday it will be clear why this happened to you, even though it's not clear right now. Things like that, which are often meant to be words of encouragement, I think can be heard by sufferers as these sort of mandates for what their suffering must mean and how they're supposed to see it and relate to it. So I think the challenge of preaching on this issue is to try and offer up resources for thinking about this in relation to the tradition and the scriptures, to offer up those resources without sort of misrepresenting the real uncertainty that we have about God's relationship to suffering. I would love to see us as Christian communities kind of practice sitting with the unknown about our own lives and our own suffering. And if there are ways that preachers can help us do that, to sort of sit with, for example, stories like Hagar, where it doesn't, give us the explanation for why this is happening that we so want. It doesn't resolve in a neat and tidy way that helps us make sense of everything that happened. I mean, even just trying to invite our congregations into those stories that are messy and unresolved, I think that can serve as a sort of training or practice for real life, for those situations in our lives that we cannot make sense of all the time. If we can invite that through our preaching, I think we would be better off in some ways.
Thanks for that answer. I have a couple of questions I'm seeing here that are people relating to parts of their own experiences of depression and asking questions around that. So one person is saying, thank you again for your profound work and looking forward to the book, and wondering about the connection between the wilderness and spiritual life. For this person, depression has really meant the loss of a kind of contemplative connection to God. And they've had to train themselves not to trust certain negative feelings. They say, for example, the darkness isn't going to last forever. I'm not about to have a heart attack, these kind of ways of negating certain feelings that come up. But that this has also largely meant the end to a kind of emotional and personal relationship with God in a very kind of profoundly dry land. Kind of wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your suffering, and I can relate to that in many ways. I'll tell you what, one thing I have thought about in writing this book is how often in the scriptures, these stories of the wilderness are their memories. They're memories of things that happened. And for what it's worth, I have found some consolation in the fact that so often these communities in the scriptures, these figures in the scriptures, are not necessarily talking about how profound their experience of God is in this moment. They're remembering what God used to feel like, or they're clinging to what they know about God because of something that happened in the past. And while I certainly relate to the desire to experience God in this present and immediate way that it sounds like the questioner has experienced God in the past, and I hope that maybe you will again. I also take some solace in the fact that the scriptures seem to suggest that there were lots of times when what people had was their memories of God. and that those memories they sort of bear witness to God's faithfulness, even when we don't feel God so immediately. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, the importance of these memories and clinging to them in these dry times. But I certainly, if other commenters have responses to that or other thoughts, I'd welcome that. It's such an important and real question for those who are struggling.
Yeah, I do think another question I think that has kind of come in that's tied to this is what about finding the presence of God for someone who's a teenager? This person says 14 years old, who's fairly young, who may not have as many, sort of memories of God to draw from, and who wants to feel the presence of God in their life now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one reason why I have been so captivated with Hagar's story in particular, as I mentioned during my talk, is because I've been longing for stories in the Christian scriptures, for Christian stories of people who experience suffering without justification, who experience suffering without purpose. I wonder if similarly, rather than trying to facilitate an experience of God for this teenager who's struggling, there might be a way to introduce this teenager to figures, faithful figures who also struggled with, perceiving the presence of God. That might be a way of sort of meeting this teenager where they are, while also communicating that their very real experience of the absence of the presence of God has a place within the Christian experience, and the experience of people of faith well beyond Christianity as well.
The next question is also a sort of question about something you've been describing about, the ways in which well-meaning comments about depression can sort of go awry. And this is someone who was shared that they were told that depression is like being wounded by beauty. And they find that to be a paradox, since it means that in some way it would be beautiful to be wounded by depression, which is not this experience. So do you have they're just asking if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think a unique expression of a larger social narrative that we actually hear quite often these days. Often it takes the form of like the tortured artist, right? Mm-hmm. That it is somebody's depression or their mania or some other trauma in their life that is the source of their profound insight or their genius. And while certainly there are lots of incredible artists and geniuses who have experienced various forms of trauma and depression and mania and conditions like that, I think that just like the questioner suggested, it can be really detrimental to universalize from those experiences that somehow these conditions are actually quite romantic and wonderful, or that these conditions are a gateway to something that people desire. I think that can be really, really harmful to the sufferers themselves. And I think it can really kind of confuse onlookers to these conditions who often actually, need to reach out and help people rather than just, romanticize their condition. So I'm sorry that this person was told that. If it was, it sounds like that was not a welcome statement. But unfortunately, there's there's lots of ways that we have sort of stoked that romantic view of mental illness throughout broader society.
Mm. And the next question, I think, kind of continues that worry about a sort of romanticism, or ways in which, we kind of have this language or images that kind of can embed us into a sense of, oh, well, this is just how this should go on. And this person is actually asking, even if wilderness experiences that we find in the Bible might suggest that we as Christians, kind of tolerate depressive struggles more than we should.
Mm-hmm. I think some of them, if sort of universalized, could be used that way. This is where I think, like I mentioned, the image of the wilderness has a lot of different sort of theological implications and uses, even in the scripture. And there's benefits to that, as I tried to suggest. There's also dangers to that, because if we take any one of them and universalize it, I think we can very easily romanticize people's suffering. This is also where I think it's really important, if we're going to kind of engage this wilderness imagery, to be very clear and direct about the fact that even these wildernesses where God, kind of shows up, where God does amazing things, where, it all seems worthwhile in the end, even then, the wilderness is a very, very difficult place. I'm sure there's tons of brilliant Bible scholars at Candler who could tell us more about this than I know, but at least in my research, it seems very clear, like, by definition, the wilderness is inhospitable to human beings. It is difficult to live there, even for people who live there for a long time. And so I think we have to not lose sight of that as we talk about this, lest we do slip into this kind of romanticism that the questioner is raising as a rightful concern.
Yeah. I'm also seeing a number of a practical question that a number of folks are asking, which is if this is going to be available to this webinar for them after the fact. So I do just want to say that this is being recorded and will be available after the fact for folks who want to share, what Jessica has shared and these kind of wonderful resources that she's mentioned with other people. It will be available through the Aquinas Center's YouTube page. I also do want to note that my colleague Alice Cameron has put a little survey into the link. If you want to click on that, we just want to ensure that we continue to offer you, topics that really meet the needs of the day, as Jessica is doing right now. So, and then a really practical question for you, Jessica, was that someone was asking about the theologian who quoted Susan Sontag. If you could tell us who that was again.
Yeah, Richard Arundel, and so it's ARRAD. AND, LE, I think is how it's spelled. If you email me, I will send you a PDF of this essay where he talks about the image of wilderness in relation to kind of societal stigma and moralizing about depression. He wrote this relatively short article. I think it's maybe 6,000 words or less, but I have just returned to it over and over again. It's a real gem. And I think he writes just really, really compellingly about the wilderness as an alternative to this enemy language, this battle language that we use for depression. And as some of you may know from Sontag's work, other conditions like cancer and things like that. So happy to send that to you if you would like.
That's great. And then one, I think probably we're nearing the last one or two questions for our time together. So this question is thanking you for your talk, and kind of your hesitancy about prescription of meaning makes them wonder about desert monasticism and the desire to go into the wilderness to find God. And do you think that the desert fathers and mothers give us any insight into depression?
I would be remiss to say they don't offer us any insight. I mean, those those writings are just so rich for so many reasons. But I think, the question, it seems to me, is already suggesting one difference between the sort of occasion of the desert experience of these early church figures and depression sufferers today, which is that depression sufferers today consistently assert, I did not will this for myself. And so it is not a choice. And I think it's important for us to be clear about that, because one way that that a lot of people respond negatively to depression is by saying, oh, just like cheer up, as if it was a choice or something like that. Depression is unwilled. And so in that sense, the occasion for the desert experience is different than the church fathers and mothers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other aspects of their experience, other theological insights that they have wouldn't be rich and applicable for thinking about depression.
Thanks, Jessica. And just the last question is, how have your students received this work? Someone's wondering how it's landing sort of with the younger generation, Gen Z folks.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because something that gives me a great deal of hope is that I find just a tremendous difference in how younger people are talking about depression and mental health conditions more broadly, compared to even, somebody like me. I'm in my mid-30s, and just the difference, the desire to educate themselves about these conditions, the openness with which they support people in their lives who are struggling. They're just sort of know-how about accessing resources. It is different. And that gives me hope that this generation will continue to push everybody else to do the difficult work that needs to be done to make our church communities and broader society a place where people with depression and other conditions can be supported and live better lives. They are also, I think, very hungry for theological resources about this. For all the, real religious disillusionment and skepticism that I see among young people, I think it is around these issues of suffering that they very readily, want answers from religion. And still believe that religion has something to offer. And so, when it comes to depression, they're very, very open to thinking about not just what the church has done wrong, and a lot of them have strong opinions about what the church has done wrong around these issues, but they, I think, still have some curiosity about what the church could offer, and as I said, a desire to do that work, to collaborate. So I hope we'd listen to them and learn from them on these issues.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being open to their curiosity, to the needs that we all have for more robust Christian theological resources for thinking about depression. Thank you for joining us for Aquinas Day and for being our speaker. It's been so wonderful to be in conversation. And we want to thank all of you who are on the call as well for joining us. And we hope to see you in person next year. And until then, we do invite you to join us virtually on March 15th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll be speaking with Dr. Shannon D. Williams about the stories of U.S. Black Catholic nuns. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.